we definitely talked about different series that cover dystopias. Here, the state controls the women that bear children. That's basically the story, of course, of The Handmaid's Tale. I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Hello there.
And I think an interesting question this time is this idea about dystopias. Um, they're kind of not simply science fiction in some different ways. To me, they're almost like in some a psychological or social horror in some. I don't know what your thoughts are about kind of just dystopia and how different times they're a vision of something darker, I guess, in sci-fi.
I think each dystopia that we see in fiction has to be, it seems quite broad ranging probably when the person first thinks this up, but actually it becomes like a very focused part of one aspect of our lives that can get sort of expanded. And what tends to happen is in real life, as we've seen with the Brave New World mediating effect of all things, is that, yeah, these things do come to pass, but they come to pass in a way that's not quite as threatening as we would anticipate. I mean, we're looking with The Handmaid's Tale at something that is a totalitarian regime that has taken over America. And there are aspects of our lives, especially during COVID, that have become more totalitarian. I mean, if you have any online account now, basically, you've given up all your privacy. It's a subtle change, but I remember when I went through border control to get into the US, before, as somebody English, you put down your 4 fingers, they'd scan your passport, they'd take a photo, they'd ask you what you're doing there. About at least 2 of those steps have been removed now. They no longer scan your fingers.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think actually they even scanned my passport. They just took my photograph,
mm-hmm.
and they asked me what the purpose of my visit was and who I was going to see.
Interesting.
So that shows you that, like, the amount of data that they have just based on your face and maybe even a name is enough for them to correlate enough that they feel secure letting you into the country.
Right.
So, and that's really just in the last year. So that's quite a big, it's subtle, but it's a big change in a way.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that this book by Margaret Atwood was written in the 80s, a time that, like, to me, I think that's another interesting connection with, Valley Girl and stuff, which we watched. To me, like, a lot of times the 80s, I kind of call it the age of trivia pursuit, like, kind of where, like, things, a lot of times were pretty frivolous, other than, of course, like the fear of nuclear destruction and like, kind of, just basic teen angst and the other kind of things. It seemed like, like things were relatively, like quiet, I guess, in a way. It's like, because I think there's an optimism about, like, kind of, because as the 80s were ending, we even though we didn't see the Berlin Wall coming down, I think there was an optimism that, like, things were getting better and stuff like that. But I think what Atwood was kind of really hinting at, or was kind of driving at, was that, like, there's a movement, kind of like the right wing to basically reverse the things of, like, women's rights and like, in other words, there was a revival of religious fundamentalism that was kind of an undercurrent of that, and I didn't really see that, or I didn't really believe that was kind of like, I don't know, I guess I feel like in some ways it wasn't as much in people's main thoughts of what was going on and stuff. But I think, so you kind of hinted at, actually, there are people kind of, like, really, they're trying to, like, move things in that direction, like, kind of, of basically that a woman's place is, like, in the home, and, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think what she's really sort of, like, highlighting is this fact that our attitudes towards sort of various progressive agendas are not necessarily linear. Like, if we kind of had this idea that, women's rights has gradually increased over time, but that's really not the case. There had been periods when, you could even argue that ancient Egyptian culture was perhaps more sort of pro-feminine than, several hundred years after it. And then there were sort of peaks and troughs the whole way. And I mean, it's just as likely that we could have a trough rather than a peak in the grand scheme of things. And I think that's what's really clever about A Handmaid's Tale, and what makes it so original in sort of modern contemporary sci-fi. is this idea that that's the last thing we're expecting is something where we have a complete reversal to a medieval state of rights for women.
Yeah, I think let's dive into the kind of the 1990 movie version of stuff. What's interesting, I think, to me, first off, is that like it just definitely didn't connect with audiences as much.
No.
I feel like like kind of like I was saying that wasn't on people's minds that like that there was this kind of movement or that there was this current of like kind of reverting to more conservative values and stuff like that. And I think that's like kind of the number one thing, like kind of why it just like didn't really click.
I mean, I can tell you what. I mean, from my impressions of watching this is that the reason it didn't click is that it doesn't show you the consequences for going against the system.
Oh.
Like what's the difference with a TV show is that you see in the red center, pretty much from the word go, Janine, who challenges the authority, she gets her eye taken out.
Yeah.
Just for speaking out, she gets her eye removed. People are getting tasered and beaten for questioning this authority. You don't see any of that in the 1990 version. It's kind of just implied that everyone just kind of goes along with it, and then she turns up at the house and she's talking to Faye Dunaway.
Right.
So, I mean, that's where the lack of realism comes in, is that realistically, people to be taken away from their husbands and their lives and be put into a situation where they'd be routinely raped and having their children taken away, people would fight, I mean, we're not that removed from the protests of the 60s and various other things that this would just go easily. And I'm trying to think who actually sort of adapted this. The interesting thing is like the screenplay is by Harold Pinter, who's a very sort of famous English TV writer and movie writer, and has written some very edgy stuff in England.
Okay.
And when I watched this, I was quite taken aback by how unedgy or how uninteresting actually the screenplay was. I was expecting something a little more, multi-dimensional, we'll say.
Yeah.
And it was fairly by the numbers. It did what I was kind of hoping to some degree, in that it didn't give you everything. It didn't just explain to you everything that was going on. But I mean, also it didn't really reveal, the inner turmoil that would have been going on with a lot of the people who'd just been thrown into this situation.
Apparently, I guess he just kind of got exhausted with the writing and like basically just kind of just dropped the project and stuff like that after a certain point. Yeah, that's something that I didn't realize, but I just kind of, looked a little bit more into the notes of, and so, between that and some of these different kind of complex projects, like kind of the whole development hell thing kind of happens and stuff. And that's apparently what happened with this one, that like, it's basically where, even though his name's on there as a screenwriter stuff, he actually, basically said that he wasn't happy with the movie. Like, he was trying to get his name removed actually and stuff like that.
Oh,
and,
really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
it doesn't surprise me, to be honest with you, because
okay.
I mean, Harold Pinter, I mean, he's done lots of sort of theater and TV work, and it's always been pretty interesting stuff. And it doesn't surprise me that was, because I was watching this, so that really, this is a Harold Pinter.
Interesting. Yeah, I was familiar with his other work, so yeah. But I just kind of like just came across that story and stuff. I guess like you said, one of the things that I'm not sure if that's been remade. We'll have to look at that. The French Lieutenant's Woman, I guess, like kind of one of those.
French Lieutenant's Wife. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, maybe it has actually.
We'll have to kind of look into that and see.
Definitely.
Everything.
Yeah, I mean, it reeked of a movie that was, someone read the book, it's obviously a good story, and they thought, okay, this is going to make a really interesting adaptation. And then, the studio got involved, and you can see you can just see these overarching, claws of the studio coming in and changing it. Because even the opening titles, it's like, once upon a time, there was a story of a society that went wrong. That wrong society was Gilead. I mean, even from that, I thought I can imagine Margaret Atwood just looking at that and thinking, oh God, what have they done now? and then it was kind of like the really sort of distasteful thing is you know, they try to kind of sex it up in a weird sort of way, and that
Mm.
you've got a rape scene with the commander and Offred, and then next, within minutes, you've got the driver kind of trying to make out with her, and she's there sort of, you know, bare-breasted against the window and stuff, and it's kind of like it reads to this kind of thing. Oh, this isn't sexy enough. We've got to.
Yeah, and choosing Natasha Richardson, I mean, you know, like kind of that in itself, like kind of is very much. I mean, she was definitely like kind of, you know, one of the it stars during that time period, and stuff like that. And I think that was partially the thing where, um, you know, like choosing somebody who's like clearly attractive. I think like really kind of it's kind of a weird message for, you know, and certainly we'll kind of talk about, you know, in the series, right, the choice of Elizabeth Moss, stuff like that. But that kind of right the right way, like I said, like it's almost like trying to make, you know, like kind of these rape scenes, like kind of something that, like, you know, is really like kind of is a brutal thing that, you know, like again the series kind of conveys, but I think is like
Mm,
kind of just trying to make it into something a little bit more tantalizing, or like you know, like just yeah, just something like kind of a little more titillating, I guess, and stuff. And it's kind of a, you know, just it's a very um, a choice that very clearly takes things in another direction and stuff.
yeah, I mean, they try to sort of their version of portraying this as traumatic is that she comes in and she sees the glass of milk waiting for
Mm-hmm.
her, and she smashes it against the wall,
Mm-hmm.
and it's kind of, okay, I'm angry, and I try washing my face, washing the dirt on it, but you don't see that prolonged kind of tension and trauma with the interrelationships between Serena Joy and the commander and everything else, and her trying to balance this against her survival, which is, you know, it's just it's not, it doesn't have the depth of the TV show in that respect, I would say.
Yeah, I feel like in a lot of ways we're watching the Reader's Digest version of Margaret Atwood's novel.
It does feel that way. Yeah, it feels like it skims over stuff, and I think just the way they kind of, the way they portrayed Nick, or the you know, the driver, is just kind of
Yeah,
this lumbering guy who's kind of like vaguely attractive, and he just
right,
immediately starts making out with her, and she's, you
right,
know,
right,
she's literally been raped like half an hour ago or something like that,
right.
a couple of hours or something. You're just like, it's just so unrealistic compared to, you know, given the scenario. um
I think yeah. What's called? We'll mention a couple kind of the other stars and stuff like that right off. So Robert Duvall plays the
mm,
commander. We
yeah,
haven't actually talked about him for some reason. Like he's definitely clearly a big actor in a lot of different, you know, kind of key movies in that time period. So this is like kind of an interesting choice also for him. And then Faye Dunaway, who we talked about from Thomas Crown Affair, as Serena Joy.
yeah,
So I think that that was like a good casting. Like if you were going for something where it's more by the book, because apparently the novel kind of has Serena Joy as kind of somebody who's an older woman who, like, you know, can't
okay,
bear children and all that kind of stuff, as opposed to the backstory that the series kind of covers again. And then
mm,
finally, Aidan Quinn as Nick. He was kind of like in that time period also like a not a huge star, but he kind of a lot of times will play roles of like you said, kind of play, you know, a sometimes being menacing, and other times just generally kind of like a roguish kind of attractive, you know, kind of anti-hero, I guess, and stuff.
mm. Yeah, no, I thought Faye Dunaway was very interesting. I mean, that's the thing, is like when you're watching the credits for this role,
Mhm.
and you see all the names of the celebrities, think Robert Duvall, Faye Dunaway, this
Yeah,
Harold Pinter, you know, you really think this should be good, you know,
right.
and but yeah, it's a very kind of simplified version of the story in a way. It doesn't really show any of the, very little time is spent really on the trauma that, and the fact that they've been kidnapped and taken away, and then she's lost her daughter. I mean, there's a few flashbacks to her seeing her
Right.
daughter, but
And
it's not
that's it.
really, you know, we don't see much of what's happened there. Also, the Red Center, there's really no depth into, as I say, you know, you don't see the suffering and the amount of effort that goes into sort of, you know, brainwashing them to make sure they behave in the certain way that they're supposed to in their role as the handmaid.
I think just kind of like, you know, the Brave New World and stuff. biggest challenge is you have this kind of dystopia that is so far removed from, like kind of things are, that it's really hard for you as a audience to connect with what's going on. You really kind of like, where are we? How do we get there? The basic questions you have as a viewer. And I feel like, as we'll get into with the series, they do a much better job of it, kind of like building on layer after layer. So you kind of like, and meanwhile, you're getting deeper and deeper into what's happened and how did we get there and stuff like that. So you first connect with the main character. And I feel like that's the thing that, like, as much as, again, Natasha Richardson is attractive and stuff like that, but we don't really, we just, it's kind of like, other than the kind of the voyeurism and stuff like that, I don't feel like we really are kind of understanding, or we don't necessarily feel like kind of the kind of same sympathies that we will for Elizabeth Moss playing kind of the Kate, or actually Alfred character. She's of course called June in that one.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting the difference in this compared to the TV show is that they kill the husband off immediately. And of course, I should mention, as always, spoilers right from the get-go. We're going to be talking about everything in this and the TV show. So make sure you're up to date, or at least up to the end of season 3, because that's what I watched up to on this. And yeah, I think this is the choice that the TV show made to keep the husband alive and show that, the suffering that he has to go through. It makes you and him wanting her to survive and seeing what she has to go through in order to sort of get her children back, actually makes you connect with that character much more than if the husband was just dead, because if there's no kind of
hope,
or I'll kind of in a way sort of at a point where you have to actually face that person that you say, well, I accidentally fell in love with the driver and blah. It adds a lot of different complexity to the story. And I mean, they're only telling this story in an hour and 45 minutes as opposed to and so there's obviously corners to be cut, but I think for me that the main thing was that it didn't really show enough of the difficulty that it would be to be put in that position.
I mean, I think to the movie's credit, it did it was pretty true to the world of like kind of where they had like kind of the terminology and stuff where like the whole idea of off Glen, like the idea that your name becomes like the master or the head of the household is gives you your name and stuff like that. And then we kind of also see this kind of like you have like the aunts, the Marthas. You see this world where like kind of there's these casts and stuff like that of different women's roles like kind of within it. And then also you see glimpses of this kind of rebellion that like I think that's what's funny about anytime we have these worlds that like this is kind of this government and stuff like that, there's always kind of like a rebellion force. Like we saw this in Brave New World. We like and even like kind of like we're both fans of Star Wars and stuff. When you have this empire, you have a rebel alliance and everything.
Of course, yeah. No, I mean, I think actually one of the things that's most interesting about Handmaid's Tale is this splitting up of the roles that women play and delineating them into these different roles. Like you have the Marthas that are basically there doing all the cooking and the cleaning.
Right.
And you have the aunts that are there as the disciplinary sort of matriarchal kind of figure in a way.
Yeah.
And then you have the handmaids as the ones that produce the children and are in an odd sort of way like albeit in a limited way, this sort of sexualized version of femininity. And then you have the wives, which they more or less represent sort of acquiescence to whatever the men say, really. They don't really, they don't represent much more, I would say, in terms of the role. I mean, of course, obviously that develops as the TV show goes on.
Sure.
But it's interesting how she's kind of split it out that way into these 4 distinct roles.
And I think, ironically, you can kind of see that in you know, like kind of your typical conservative view, right, of women and stuff. That
Right.
you know, like the whole idea that women have their place is like kind of the
Yeah.
basic kind of, you know, one of the basic tenets and stuff. And you have like your kind of trophy wife, you know, that kind
Mm.
of you know, oh by the way, like kind of, you know, like the most recent ex-president kind of exemplifies stuff like that. This kind of that she's there for show, and like, you know, like she doesn't get involved with issues, unlike the previous, you know, kind of with Michelle Obama or any of the other kind of or you know, Hillary Clinton, never mind, and stuff. You know, like they don't get their hands dirty in politics and stuff. And overall, like kind of, you know, it's like this thing of that it's what's underneath all this, of course, is this idea that religion is the driving force of how things should be governed too. You know, that's
Mm.
another interesting concept that we haven't talked about yet. But and I think that's like, it's something that like we see much more heavily in the Middle East and stuff. But it's something that, like, ironically, as much as we're combating, you know, like kind of these terrorists, whatever else stuff, we're trying to almost do, you know, like kind of, or we've tried to do, you know, like kind of within our democratic free society and everything.
Mm. Yeah, no, it's very interesting. Once again, we've got a bit like Watchmen. We've got something that introduces masks on a big scale
Right.
way before it happened. You know, even the 1990 version has most of the handmaids wearing masks, and
Oh
also
yes.
the women who've, I mean, the way they portray the women who've kind of fell off the useful ladder and become like the fodder for the colonies, in the 1990 version, obviously they're there sort of sweeping up the streets and things like this, but they're all wearing sort of masks in that role, but the others aren't, which is interesting.
Mm.
Whereas in the TV show, you have the handmaids, who I suppose, if you think about it in the pecking order of how the Handmaid's Tale hierarchy of women goes, you know, the handmaids are pretty much at the top, really. But they're the ones who are, you know, veiled eventually once you get. I don't know if you got made it to season 3, but basically that's
No.
the thing is in season 2 they start covering and silencing.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm spoiling it for you now,
No, no, no problem.
but that's the interesting thing. They go to Washington D.C. and this is obviously, you know, the epitome of their control over women. And they've not only veiled them, but they've also put these rings in their mouth to stop them from talking completely.
Oh,
These
good
metal
lord.
rings. Yeah, it's quite shocking when you see that. It's shocking, but it's also kind of stupid as well, because how would they
Mm.
eat? You know, it's like you'd have to
Yeah.
consistently take out metal rings, let them eat, and then put them in. You know, it'd just be so many infections, various other things. It makes for a very shocking scene, but it's kind of one of those things that realistically it just wouldn't happen. But yeah, it's and I guess if I had any sort of criticism of the TV show, it kind of just felt like after season 1, which was basically the book, season
Yes.
2 just becomes a way of how can we put women in a position where they're suffering, and we'll just see them sort of suffer in various different, you know,
Mm.
situations that get progressively worse and worse and worse going forward. But yeah, it's but anyway, I'll get into the way it's all sort
Right.
of
Right.
laid out in the
Right.
TV show later on. But yeah, I mean, it's you're absolutely right in terms of this sort of oppression of women is sort of it's married with this idea that there's an unscientific approach to it, and you know you have to eschew science in order to subjugate women in this way as well.
Hmm.
Um, which I don't know that necessarily that would happen.
Yeah,
That's
you and
one
I
thing.
have talked about that offline.
You
Yeah,
know,
like
you could do it in different
well,
ways. You
I
know,
mean,
but
what happens? You know, like kind of you have some kind of virus or something that kind of something that, you know, is spreading through you know, the human race, that like you know, less and less women are able to be fertile and bear children and stuff like that. What would be the, you know, impact of that? I think it's an interesting question, because even if, like, you know, we don't have this kind of dystopia stuff, it definitely kind of, I think the closest thing to kind of what's happened in you know, the real world is how you have like some of these countries where, in fact, like the populations have been kind of really dwindling. Like more recently, I was watching a thing about Russia, like, you know, that they're struggling with population, you know, there's kind of been declines of population as echoes of, you know, the World War II devastation and stuff. You know, because like if you were apparently up to I think the age of, you know, 20s and stuff like that, and you know, what's it called? You had a 30% chance of survival, like kind of, you know, like if you were born between something like the years of 1920 to 1930 or something like that, and everything, and you know, and then, you know, because of how many, you know, these young men that they lost, that not only did it kind of create an impact in the generation immediately after war, but been this kind of continuing echo of that, like, you know, at each point there's been population declines, and you know, I mean, I haven't seen anything kind of policy wise that they've done. It's funny that China had the opposite of problem, that like they were, you know, having such a population increase that they, you know, had the one child rule and stuff like that. But now they're starting to see the echoes of the fact that, like, you know, now you have like these much more men than are women and stuff like that. And so I think it's kind of similar to like kind of, you know, how Australia different times kind of tampered with nature and like trying to, you know, control the population of kangaroo or whatever, something like that. I think anytime we try to do these things, we're just asking for it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, that's the thing that doesn't sort of fundamentally make sense about Handmaid's Tale, is that, especially the TV show, because really the first series goes up, it sets the stage, and it shows you that the punishments for disobeying the law is very severe, and you might get killed and stuff. But then by the time you get to season 2, there's lots of people getting killed.
Yeah.
And you just think, well, surely
right.
in a population where you're trying to, you know, prevent the decline of people, you wouldn't want to kill that many people, right. You know, and you certainly wouldn't be killing any handmaids. You know, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Because that's a certain point, there's nobody left to, you know, kind of make into any of the other roles and stuff, with Marthas and so on.
But I mean, I guess you can chalk that up to the fact that, you know, this is a sort of totalitarian system that is out of control and in decline, and is kind of spiraling out. And that's the funny thing. It seems like this terrible threat, but really, I think they're trying to document what happens when this kind of regime loses control and actually stops making sense. I think that's the idea. But yeah, I mean, and that's the thing as well. Would you really, you know, if you were trying to increase the population and make sure children were protected and you know, you wanted to create the perfect environment there, would you actually, you know, negate all science in that situation? I don't think you would. I think actually what would really happen is that actually all of your scientific efforts would be pushed towards making sure that as many children as possible could be born. So I don't know that, you know, it doesn't really make sense to me that you would kind of go completely backwards in terms of your attitude towards certainly medical, you know, because they kind of take the religion with the medical stuff and take it all backwards.
Well, I think the closest kind of comparison would be what's happened recently with COVID and stuff, you know, like where you had this kind of struggle, right, between science and these kind of, you know, beliefs and stuff, you know, like kind of, you know, like, can you, you know, is it possible that, like, you know, if you disbelieve that there's a problem, that, you know, like kind of science won't, you can negate science and stuff like that. And of course, you know, as we know, unfortunately, the answer is no. Like kind of, you know, a virus is not going to care what your belief system is and stuff. It's going to affect you regardless. And you know, short of course, you know, when a vaccine finally kind of kicks in and stuff.
I mean, yeah, if you look at vaccine rates of 55% across the US generally,
that
shows you that basically 45% of people don't believe in science. Essentially, which is quite a scary number, really. But it kind of brings home this point that, you know, could a regime that sort of says, okay, well, science is not really, we need to get back to traditional values, forget all this science and these experts. You know, if 45% of the country is not, you know, getting a vaccine, then it would get quite a lot of support, you know. And I think that's what's quite interesting about this.
So here's a question then. I feel like that if this was like 1920, say, you know, like kind of and stuff, and we're talking like the Spanish flu, of course, and stuff like that. If there was a vaccine that was made, I feel like in different ways there would not be this argument. So
No.
here we are, much more advanced, right, with technology and in theory, like kind of that we're more knowledge wise, we have much more than ever before, and yet we have like more ignorance. It feels like kind of than ever. Like what's this?
Well,
causing this disparity.
It's not ignorance; it's distrust. Basically, it's like nobody trusts anything anymore because we see the massive inequality and various other things. We now find out that not everything was done with our best intentions at heart.
Right.
So, yeah, it's not a matter of lack of faith in science. It's we know that science is powerful. It just depends on who's wielding it and who profits out of it at the end of the day.
I think it goes back to the thing of fake news then, right? Where at different times, maybe this scientist is saying this, but can we really trust the scientists? Because the fact that maybe they have an agenda, or maybe that they're invested in like kind of what's happening with the vaccine and stuff like that. I think that's partially this unfortunate state that we've gotten where different times we're not sure who to believe or what to believe and stuff.
Yeah, it's over complexity. I mean, we have lots of, you can go online, you can find 10 different answers to the same question. Maybe something that just says, well, the Bible says this, and we're pretty confirmed that this is the best approach for our country. Let's just go with that. That simplification of things is actually can get a lot of support. I mean, look at recent political leaders
And the thing is, along with that is that, along with the kind of distrust of the news, is the fact that before we would go to the newspapers and watch television and stuff like that, and there was some degree of trust, there was this kind of standard that the news media followed and everything like that. But now, because of social media and the algorithms and stuff, that we're a lot of the news that we're getting and everything. The problem is that if we believe one way, the algorithms are driven for us to kind of get into this kind of I think we talked about this before, the whole tunnel effect of that you're going to get news that supports your beliefs and stuff.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I mean, I think if you expand that into the idea of a regime like this taking over, you just have to make sure that your tunnel view is big enough to actually overthrow a country, essentially. If you can create a tunnel, and that's what's kind of interesting about the whole QAnon thing, and on the opposite side, the very sort of, I can't remember their name now, but the very extreme sort of liberal approach is that really if you manage to create a 60-70% tunnel of reality for these people, for people to exist in, then you could quite easily overthrow whatever the government was at the time.
Well, I shared with you, we came pretty damn close, much closer than I ever imagined, because with the just before the inauguration, there were people that were protesting, kind of the recount of the votes and stuff like that, and they basically, I mean, it was really an attempted coup. I mean, kind of, for lack of a better word. I mean, granted, they didn't have to back in the military, and granted, they didn't have weapons and stuff. But if they had, I mean, I'm sure that we would right now be in a pretty Gilead, or pretty close to a Gilead state right now.
I mean, I think it's interesting because in the TV show they have the three main sort of seats of power being attacked in the US. The House, the Congress, and the Senate. And let's just say this attack that happened, let's just say one of those guys had a bomb on him and he just blew himself up and killed everyone who was in the building. So you've effectively taken out one of the main centers of control of the government in one fell swoop. If you did that in two places, you don't even have to do all three like in the show. That would be a major it'd be massively destabilizing effect on a country that's built on these things. It's
can you imagine the stock market after that happened?
Man. So a lot of our conversations are always sort of
right.
sort
Goes
of
back.
against this background of like what would happen to the stock
Oh,
market in various
man.
situations.
Yeah.
But yeah, yeah, it's not as far out of the realms of possibility that people think, and I think that's what's sort of very good about Handmaid's Tale. It shows you, and especially the TV show, because it shows you this subtle progression of how a terrorist attack that was actually organized becomes something that's actually planned domestically and is an organized thing to sort of overthrow the government. And then how various, it starts with things like your bank accounts being frozen and only being able to be your husband being able to withdraw money.
Yeah.
And the women lose their jobs but the men keep them. And I mean, I don't often sort of cite David Icke in this because I don't necessarily agree with all of his stuff. But I mean, the totalitarian tiptoe, I think, is a very interesting concept. This idea of that we're all sort of gradually sort of moving towards a more totalitarian sort of ways of governing. And yeah, they do that very cleverly in the TV show. They show you the progression. And I think as well, they also show you the realistic reaction to a lot of these things. Like someone who's more reactive will just say, well, look, okay, I've lost my job. I can't get my money out. It's time to leave this country. I've got to pack up and leave at this point. Whereas other people will think, nah, I'll give it a few more months. Things will turn around.
Right.
And then it doesn't. And I think, well, okay, I'm going to drive up to the border. I'll just drive over the road to Canada. Oh, we're getting chased down by police now. It's kind of, I think they did that very realistically, and they actually really staged that really cleverly in the way that these things could progressively get worse over time, and not necessarily a long period of time, but it's very difficult to tell the actual time period that all these things have effect. But the way they condense it enough, it makes you realize, our perception of these things could be pretty quick, really.
Let's dive into the series then. For me, like it's a lot like Westworld, and of course it was like that was one of the first discussions we had. So that here you have production that not only expands on the world building and the story that's kind of told and stuff, it just kind of drives a narrative in different directions that's really engaging and like kind of really brings you in. It's not an easy watch by any stretch. It's kind of there's a lot of there's a lot of things that like kind of dark and all that. But at the same time, it really sucks you in. Like I think as we kind of briefly mentioned, Elizabeth Moss, she's great at playing like these traumatized women that in fact we'll be kind of talking about her again in Invisible Man and stuff, and like here she plays Offred, like the role that Natasha Richardson of course had, and we really just like she's not only the audience surrogate, but we really just kind of just are just beyond rooting for her. Like we're just kind of like a combination of like kind of just feel like the devastation of what's happened in her world, and we really kind of just like are hoping against hope that like somehow she's going to survive all this this horror.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the TV show, your main drivers are, will she get the kids back and make it to Canada, basically. So that's your kind of the carrot on the stick that they kind of feed you with a lot of it. But I mean, yeah, for me, what was really interesting about certainly the first season, which is closest to the novel, is this idea of world building. You basically see how this world is built through the events of what happens to her and how she has to endure the Red Center, what happens to her afterwards. And so you basically learn about how this world works through her in that first season. The second season becomes more of a character-driven narrative rather than a world-driven narrative, in that you're trying to basically then root for her. And I mean, I actually have to say, I found the second season pretty slow, to be honest with you, because essentially you're watching her in warehouses kind of filling time for the first 3 or 4 episodes, and then she gets recaptured, and then it's kind of, then it just seems like everything is engineered that every 20 minutes or so somebody is going to be crying about something, and it's either, and I'm being very superficial here because I binge
Sure.
watched this in such a compressed period of time, but it seems like, okay, well, we want to sort of tell more about the unwomen and the colonies, so we're going to see what hardships they went through.
Well, what I got to say about that though was that I felt like what in you just seeing what you're saying about the warehouses, what that kind of did for me was fill in a little bit more of the blanks of like how did we get there? That like we got a lot of the through the layering of this first season. Like how did we get there? Because by the flashbacks and stuff. But then through season 2, just the warehouses alone, like to me, the first warehouse was the idea that like they tore down all the signs. Like imagine your world, right, and all the signs are gone. Like where would you go? How would you get there, or something like that? That was an interesting question. And then the other thing was they basically massacred. Again, major spoilers, stuff like that. The people of this like kind of newspaper and everything. So if you didn't have the newspaper, how would you find out what's going on? Like what would like kind of be your source of like kind of what's going on and stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. No, you're totally right. It was the removal of the signs was one of the biggest things. It's something so small and something we take for granted so much.
Because a lot of the first season, you didn't even know where you were for a while.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that was. Yeah, and I don't know if that's actually in the original novel or not.
I'm not sure. Yeah,
because unfortunately, I don't think we didn't have time to read the novel before we did our video.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it's such a sort of simple thing, but trying to get anywhere in a country without any signs is would be, a major undertaking. There's no doubt about it. I mean, even a compass would be about all you could rely on, I guess, in that situation.
I mean, to be honest, it actually reminds me of the Gulf when I was there and stuff like that, the Middle East. There are these places that there's just no signs and stuff. Yeah. And I feel like that's a form of control that these kind of totalitarian kind of governments just basically use and stuff.
Yeah, it was fascinating actually in that respect. And there, nothing got sort of replaced either. There was no replacement signs. Nope. Normally in these kind of dystopias, you see them, they sort of
with their own names and stuff.
Yeah, and that becomes like a sort of comment on whatever they're trying to sort of sell you in that. But yeah, I mean, that in itself was very interesting. And then it's the idea of making everyone's clothing a uniform was another interesting concept in this. The idea that each person wears a particular color, and the handmaids, because they're so precious, become like these bright red objects. Right. They're easy to spot, easy to spot. Yeah. So that was something that was also quite interesting for me. And the choice of this idea that the hood is something that limits their view. So they have a very limited view, and then you add the veil as well, so you're limiting. It's this kind of sensory deprivation as well as the isolation that they would have to have.
And I hate to say it, that also again gets into like kind of the Middle East, where you're basically the women have veils to kind of conceal themselves, and also like kind of not to be kind of showing flesh to kind of men and stuff, and heaven forbid to like tempt them and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, Margaret Atwood didn't make this stuff up,
No, and that's what's kind of incredible, I guess, different times too. That even though like this is kind of science fiction, but in reality, there's a lot of basis on like kind of things that have happened and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you have things like, I mean, it's interesting, with Off Glenn, the fact that basically she sort of has female circumcision for being a gender traitor in this.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's it hasn't. I don't know if it still goes. I'm sure there are still parts where that goes on, but it's this is not a thing of a relic of the past or anything like this.
Right.
This is still pretty in certain parts of the world, it's fairly commonplace.
Yeah, I should mention with her. This is Alexis Bledel, who's kind of known for her role as one of the Gilmore Girls, and one of the kind of funny comments though was that Elizabeth Moss kind of while she was like kind of doing the series and stuff, she started watching the Gilmore Girls. So, and she apparently hasn't told, like, you know, like at least on this interview, she hadn't told, you know, like Alexis that she started, you know, becoming a fangirl in some ways. And you know, granted, part of it was the idea was like being a palate cleanser, but also like kind of gave her a different perspective of this kind of, you know. I guess, you know, kind of as the seasons went on, they had less interaction, so it didn't really affect their, you know, how they acted with each other. But it's I guess it's funny sometimes, like kind of the whole real life, you know, versus acting kind of worlds, I guess, and stuff, and how we, you know, kind of react to like kind of the celebrities or the, you know, the actors.
Well, I mean, for me, another interesting sort of reaction to that was in season 3. I'm not sure you made it that far.
I read, yeah.
Right. They introduced a different commander, which is I can't remember the actor's name, but he was in The West Wing as Josh Lyman. I can't remember his name now.
Okay.
But he's in that one. He's a very kind of empathetic commander in a way who doesn't perform any of the ceremonies and is actually sort of housing rebellion in his basement.
Oh.
But in a way, he's there, I think, as a sort of audience surrogate for the male viewer to question some of the action, some of the manipulation or maybe attitudes of June's actions, but also in a sort of a wider context of women's place in society in a way. And that he kind of he sort of says, women want to be sort of like respected and not objectified, but yet why do they use their bodies to get what they want all the time?
Oh, right. Yeah.
And things like this, you know, he kind of there's all these sort of offhand remarks that kind of represent a sort of Jordan Peterson style kind of reimagining of where these sort of men's attitudes are in relation to sort of modern women in the modern world.
Right.
That's kind of interesting in the way they sort of use him as that sort of character, because he's very reasonable in many other ways as a character. So and he helps Emily escape and things like this. But
yeah, it's kind of like in some ways the devil's advocate for the kind of I mean, let's face it, what the basics this world, right, Gilead is kind of representing is kind of like male power to the nth extreme and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, you know, in effect, then, you know, it kind of makes the guys like, you know, us, like we're the bad guys. Kind of, you know, that's really what it's kind of doing. So having this reasonable person kind of, you know, having these quips and stuff like that is, you know, kind of countering, you know, like kind of that view and like having a little bit of like kind of adding a little bit of the nuance of like, okay, you know, like yeah, you know, we're all for women's rights and women empowerment and all that kind of stuff, but you know, they're not entirely the, you know, necessarily the good guys all the time either. Stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit sort of superficial, a bit sort of fallacious,
yeah.
Because at the same time, he's kind of keeping his wife hostage, and he's kind of architected this entire world and stuff like this. But his argument is kind of, as a character, is that the idea, like we're in an ecological crisis, and we have to sort of stop the world being destroyed, and we have to replenish our population. Meanwhile, cut to them hanging more people up on the wall and things like this, which again doesn't really make sense. But so it's interesting that they use him as this kind of more sort of reasonable kind of character. But it doesn't entirely work.
We kind of.
I think also what's an interesting the other interesting element is the Jezebels.
Okay, right.
Yeah, because
they kind of hinted at it. They had a little bit of it in the movie, but yeah, definitely it's a lot more of a not bigger part of the plot in the series.
Yeah, this is this kind of sort of idea that we want our wives to all be pure and clean and you know, producing babies and cleaning up like the Marthas, but we still want the Jezebels who are sort of sexy and uninhibited on the other side as well. So it's kind of, it's interesting that it kind of, you know, sort of deconstructs the male sort of psyche in that as well.
Yeah, I mean that goes back to the cliche, right? About we want a what's called a Martha Stewart, kind of in the kitchen, but we want a kind of prostitute in the bedroom and stuff like that.
Yeah. Do you think the Marthas are actually called after Martha Stewart?
That's a good question. Well, but this was, of course, before Martha Stewart was even a thing. So I'm not sure kind of how she came upon that, and it's kind of like, I think it's more like an irony that like the Martha Stewart character, developed over time, and there's like that's she almost had a name made for that brand and all that. But I think now like definitely it definitely kind of begs that question nowadays and stuff like that. So
yeah, it makes you wonder. I mean, maybe there's some Old Testament sort of bit that she was referring to, because I know that the Rachel and the other characters they sort of mention in the Gilead thing is actually based on Old Testament stuff. So yeah. And
speaking of Old Testament, I mean, it's kind of the other part about all this is that like we kind of go back to Old Testament justice, right? Like kind of just like you kind of talked about before, if the kind of eye offends thee, like kind of pluck it out and stuff. And so it's again like when we see this. I keep going back to the Middle East, but I was like kind of that like
no. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, they're cutting people's hands off for various things. It's
and these are things that are going on in modern kind of in the modern world there and stuff. And I guess sometimes I just kind of have a hard time reconciling the fact that like, okay, supposedly we're a modern society, we have more progressive views on things, but yet we're talking about like kind of possibly like kind of in the U.S. kind of going back to this kind of fundamentalism, kind of all that kind of stuff. But meanwhile, they're in the Gulf, like it's been going on, like like it's another world, like kind of like we talked in Westworld about this idea that like kind of having these kind of other worlds and stuff like that, and it's very much accepted that like if you steal, you're gonna get your hand cut off over there.
Yeah, various places you get burnt and things like this.
Or stoned.
Or stoned, yeah. And, yeah, I mean, it's pretty on the nose that they're sort of making that, connection in the TV show of A Handmaid's Tale. I guess it's the question of, it just seems like sort of 1 week after the other, if you're watching, I suppose if you were watching it weekly, but one episode after another, they introduce new elements of this each week. It's like 1 week it's the stoning, next it's the hanging, then it's the veil, then it's the it's a cavalcade of watching women
biblical
suffer, basically.
Justice.
Biblical, yeah. But by the same token, not something that's new or original or made up. These are all things that happened at various points in time.
I guess like an interesting question to pose then is if in fact like kind of something close to Gilead ever happened to the U.S. Like kind of would like kind of these different things be supported of like kind of like I think just basically going back, because part of the whole argument, right, of the kind of conservative folks is that like, oh, we've gotten too soft, kind of that like we don't have enough justice, like the prisons are overcrowded because like we should be kind of basically being more severe and on and stuff like that, and I feel like that's the argument. But meanwhile, what isn't kind of being factored into that is something we've talked about, that like a lot of times the prison systems are rigged because it's another kind of institution that like has been financed by these private companies that like I don't think we've talked about it or had a movie or series that kind of covers that, but it's basically they are designed to house and basically be run by a corporation, and like it's a big business.
Well, we have Death Race 2000.
Oh, okay. Yes.
But yeah, I know we did win each one. But yeah, but a lot of these arguments are made on the basis, oh, you're getting too soft. But they're made on the basis that there will be an enemy that will rise up and we need to fight. And this is in a very globalized society where everything is all becoming the same and values are becoming more and more uniform. It seems to me that kind of argument is prone to this idea where you have to create the enemy in order to justify this idea that you have to take things back. But I'm actually, if anything, the trend is that everything is becoming more similar, and everything is, people's values globally are becoming more aligned, and standards of living are gradually becoming more aligned as well. So the idea that you need to prepare yourself for some great sort of war or something like that seems more and more removed from reality the further you go.
And I think I'm trying to think of I think when we talk about westerns, we talk about this idea about idealizing the way things were, right? There's this ideal vision of how the like kind of the West was and stuff like that. And I feel like part of that is that like what we're really trying to preserve is the way things were for the elite, the people that have been in power, want to stay in power, and if anything, grow their power, stuff like that. And then damn the rest of you, like kind of it's like, and sometimes I feel like the series kind of did a better job than the movie of like kind of showing how like kind of the fellow brothers, right, the commanders, like kind of that Joseph Fiennes plays and stuff. They kind of like like kind of like we like kind of it's time to kind of go back to the way things were, like kind of like we've gone too far with kind of all this progressiveness and all that kind of stuff. And the idea is that like what they're really doing is kind of like institutionalizing the power in being vested in the few, and specifically of course men.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you get very much the TV show portrays this fraternity of power between the commanders.
They're even called brothers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like sorority kind of attitude there. And there's obviously clear delineations between the people who are the commanders and people who are under them that do other sort of bits and pieces and work and stuff
the eye, right? Like the Nick place, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think it also definitely ties into that sort of inequality angle as well. I think it's also interesting how it made me just think of the scene with Nick's wife is caught cheating, and they get drowned in the swimming pool. This idea that sort of public fun and pastimes are no longer possible. So it's very much in a way. This is also kind of, it feels a little foretelling of COVID a little bit, because people's lives are centered around their homes. In Handmaid's Tale, people don't really, apart from walking on the streets.
That's true, huh? Yeah.
Their lives are dictated by what happens in their home. The wives are all gardening and sewing and all this kind of stuff.
The kind of things we've been doing the past year or so. Oops.
Exactly. Yeah, and I mean, the fact that a swimming pool is no longer used as a swimming pool, and it's actually now used as a place to drown in adulterous women. Places, again, it's kind of this idea that you can't have gatherings of people where people can talk freely and collect and share thoughts freely. Hence why the handmaids are paired up and aren't allowed to talk too much in the supermarket, why they're eventually silenced and things like this.
And they only gather when it's a sanctioned kind of gathering and stuff. Because like I said, like kind of one of the things we see also in the first season is that one of the last times that there was this thing called free speech, right, and stuff, was this kind of protest, which then, of course, like, again, spoilers, that like was put down in a violent way and stuff like that. Because you just can't have like kind of people gathering, and I mean that's of course in the States like one of the basic kind of the Bill of Rights, right? The things that you're allowed to do and stuff, because of like one of the things that the British kind of were looking to get rid of was these unauthorized kind of gatherings.
Oh yeah, no, I mean there's I mean I think it is very interesting, this idea that having lots of people together to share thoughts in a free open space is something that the British government definitely is not a fan of that. And we've cracked down on it. It reminds me of like the early 90s when you had raves and basically lots of people, you just get a sound system, you'd rock up to the middle of nowhere in a field, word of mouth, people would find out, you'd all go there, you'd take lots of drugs and dance around, and hey, it's a rave. And then the police would come and kind of shut it down. And then, of course, they introduced the criminal justice bill that, you know, basically prevented this from happening. I mean, this idea, you know, the idea that you can just, you know, lots of people can gather and share their thoughts or experiences freely is, you know, something that's slowly disappearing from the world. I mean, I would say protests are becoming more and more controlled, policed, and you know.
We only touched about on that a little bit with Omega Man. That one of the kind of scenes was Charlton Heston watching clips of, I think it was Woodstock, and you know, just basically a time when people gathered and you know, like kind of, you know, granted there was the whole free love thing and stuff like that, but I think, you know, like this kind of ironic aspect, right, of like that these movements are started by these, you know, kind of gatherings and stuff. And the ideas are kind of, you know, like through this almost like a percolation, you know, like kind of, you know, like almost like something messy in the sense of like fermentation, right? Like kind of where it's like this like gathering.
Like a viral meme, perhaps. Yes.
And then like, you know, like different times you have like kind of this authoritarian, like, you know, like the Kent State Massacre or whatever, so like that. That's basically like almost like this, these antibodies attacking this, this kind of infection that's going on and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. It's yeah, from a biological perspective, you know, how do governments maintain control? But then again, you can kind of see that the same, if you want to take that biological analogy a little bit further, you can kind of see in this that the, you know, too many antibodies becomes a autoimmune disorder where it kind of destroys the host in the process of trying to protect it, which is exactly what is kind of happening in the Society of Gilead, in that there's so many controls, so many restrictions that it's basically, you know, cutting its nose to spite its face, essentially. I can't believe that after a couple of years, if the seasons, they keep hanging people and shooting them on a regular basis, your economy is going to like eventually die with no children to come in and support it. I mean, the other thing is as well, kind of a little bit of a similarity to Brave New World in this idea that, you know, they are rewarding the eyes or the guardians with what would now be considered underage children to have, you know, to have their kids with, you know, as soon as they're sort of 14 or 15 or whatever, them ripe for marriage and they're ready to reproduce. Which is a kind of a similar approach to what was in Brave New World, in that they said in that, you know, as soon as children feel like they're ready to start experimenting, you know, just let them experiment. And this is all great. And, you know, because it detracts from challenging the authorities, you let distract them with all of that stuff. Where there's a different approach in this, because it's purely for the idea of sort of replenishing the society's number of children, but this idea that some of our you know, our beliefs of what determines who is ready and who is not to have children become stretched in extreme situations.
Yeah, and you know, once again, I'm going back to kind of the comparison with the Islamic kind of thing. And again, you know, like kind of, I'm not talking about like kind of, you know, modern Muslims and stuff. So I'll kind of caveat that real quick again. I'm talking about like kind of, you know, Islamic fundamentalism, that like, you know, your reward, you know, kind of with like kind of sacrificing yourself in a kind of, you know, bombing and stuff is, you know, 40 virgins and kind of, you know, the afterlife and all that. I mean, it's again like kind of just this kind of crazy thing of like kind of where, you know, that different times it's the valuing of these kind of underage kind of brides and stuff like that versus like, you know, like an older one that like maybe has kind of been tainted by another man, or like that you know, has, never mind having their own ideas, you know, like kind of like you know, like in other words, if they're young enough, then they're kind of still not only physically untouched, but then also like kind of, you know, in terms of ideas and stuff like that, they don't get too many of, you know, their own ideas of what's acceptable and what's not and stuff.
But interestingly, that's where Handmaid's Tale deviates from, that kind of attitude. In the handmaids are passed around between the commanders.
Oh, right, yeah.
And the whole idea of purity is completely out the window.
I'm just talking more like kind of the rewards for
absolutely,
like Nick and stuff, with the young bride and stuff.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's interesting though how the wives are delineated from the handmaids in that sense,
right?
And how I can just see that as a clear kind of difference, let's say, from the overriding sort of, it's very easy to kind of point at Handmaid's Tale and say, okay, this is just basically they're trying to stop us from being fundamentalist, Muslims in America. But that's one of the things that's quite interesting actually about it.
Like it's this idea that your wife is somebody who is only yours and stuff like that. But a handmaid, like you said, is basically which whatever
public
household
property.
She's basically a public uterus, like kind of for lack of a better way of saying it.
Yeah, it is quite interesting, isn't it? That this idea that essentially, they've separated that role, and that like you said, it's public versus private in terms of the role of a woman, really.
Right.
It's quite interesting in that respect. I mean, the other sort of role that's really interesting in the TV show, that's a bit different from the movie, is the role of Aunt Lydia.
Oh yes,
because Aunt Lydia is interesting in that she's completely sort of devout and compassionate to both the mothers and the raising of children,
right?
But is absolutely ruthless in in upholding the law of the land.
Yeah,
which is a very interesting. I mean, she's one of my favorite characters from the TV show.
Interesting.
Yeah, because she's just so much fun to watch. One minute, there's a woman crying on her shoulder. Next minute, she's tasering them.
I know.
Yeah, it's
and Dell is a phenomenal actor. So
she is.
Yeah. I mean, we'll actually see her again in Manchurian Candidate if that's actually one of the remakes that she's in. So yeah, we look forward to kind of discussing more with her.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complex character because she has to. This is her own. I mean, she's hyper aware of this idea that the children are needed and are precious and have to be sort of raised, but the order must not be questioned at the same time, and also the order. She can quite clearly see that the all the power resting with the men is not necessarily like the best situation for everyone to be in. So it's an interesting balancing act she plays all the way through this. So.
Yeah, she's not the cartoonish bad guy by any stretch. Yeah.
No. She's a very interesting character in that respect.
Definitely.
And I would say in season 3 you get to see her history before what happened in Gilead, but I was a bit disappointed by that episode because it simplified her. It basically just kind of said that because she didn't get laid, she became this super, bitchy matriarch, but which I felt was a bit of an injustice to her character. I think that we could have come up with something a little bit cleverer for her than that.
What did you think of Yvonne Strahovski? I definitely, it's for me, I really have a hard time reconciling her as this kind of character, Serena Joy, because I know her from Chuck. Like, I mean, she sees, of course, the love interest. She kind of, granted, she's playing the more serious, the straight kind of person in the comedy with the Chuck character stuff. But I definitely see her as a kind of, she's clearly attractive, but also she's a, I mean, beyond like kind of the kind of the monster, I guess, that like kind of, in some ways that the Serena character is, we also just like kind of, it's really hard to sympathize for her. And I guess for me, the hard part I have reconciling is that like I see her as a character that we want to like root for and stuff.
Yeah, she's an interesting character, definitely. Yeah, and it's interesting. It's good that we've moved on to her. But I mean, funnily enough, I came from a completely opposite direction. I watched her in the Tomorrow War, where she is a sort of hard-nosed general in the future battling aliens, and then saw her as Serena Joy. So it was kind of like a step back. And in her hard-nosedness,
Right.
we'll say. Didn't know her from Chuck at all, but yeah, she's interesting in that you know, you do sympathize her because you realize what if all you want is the ability to have a child and have a family, and you're denied that through this disease that obviously gets spread, that's a very, very bitter pill to swallow, and would obviously dictate a lot of your actions in very sort of negative ways going forward. And what's interesting about her is that she kind of creates her own reality, and it shifts very much from season to season, to episode. What she thinks of, she becomes very empathetic, then she doesn't, you know. And she's very much a kind of flighty character in that, you know, she redefines her reality almost on a sort of a daily basis. One minute she's beating people, the next minute she's sort of empathizing with them and hugging them.
Right.
So she's, yeah, I mean, she's very interesting in that respect. But I mean, you chalk it all up to this idea that she's basically been denied not only her biological right, but also her kind of purpose in life by, as a writer, and you're in a society where no one can read or write. You know, it's
Interesting. Yeah.
it's kind of this thing of, you know, you don't even get the impression that she really loves her husband that much. It's just that she's trying to sort of find her place in it somehow because she's created it. You know, she is one of the
I was gonna
architects of
say,
this
yeah,
society.
that's what's really ironic, right? That she was one of the key proponents. Apparently, we get in season 2 as the backstory, that she kind of, you know, helped to create this, you know, this dystopia.
And in a way, you know, the society is basically her child as well as this.
Oh,
You know, that's the way I read it. In that, you know,
yeah.
it's difficult for her to deny. You know, if you put all this work into creating something, you can't just completely turn your back on it. So in a way, I kind of see her as the mother of the society. That's why she can't just run away to Hawaii. This is one of those shows where there's lots of points where you just think, oh, you should have just done that. Oh, you should have just done that. And like one of the ones, the bit is where she gets offered the point, you could just bugger off to Hawaii and just forget about all this nonsense. And any sane person would be like, yeah, sure, I'll go surfing in Hawaii. Go and take me to Honolulu. Forget all being, you know, subjugated on a daily basis. And also, like, well, I don't know if did you get to the bit with the rifle in the house in season 2?
No, not yet, not yet.
Oh, okay, all right.
I'm just right after the well, let's just say the handmaids have their day. I guess I just got past that episode. So to me, like, part of the whole kind of thing about it is this idea that she, you know, like I said, she kind of created this world, and I you know, I think what I missed though was in the earlier. I think they kind of intended that fairly early on, because there were some kind of references with the commander that said, "Well, you know, you're just as much responsible." I think like there's a few comments like that I didn't catch, that, like, you know, like kind of early on, because unlike the original movie, like, you know, where, you know, Faye Dunaway carries character, she's just the wife and that kind of thing. But here in this series, we see that, you know, like, Serena was like a key part, like kind of, she wrote this book, like you said, of like kind of, you know, like, oh, A Woman's Place, right? That was literally the name of it and stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, she tries to make at least the argument that, you know, and I think that's the interesting thing in season 2 is when the daughter is actually finally born. I don't know if you've got that far.
No, that's fine.
But okay, but this change of her attitude in that she sees what's happening to the women and thinks, oh yeah, hang on, I'm about to raise a daughter in this society. So, you
Interesting.
know, yeah. So obviously, and I think that's quite nice. There's lots of things in this show. They're actually kind of analogies for raising kids, marriage, and various other things.
Right.
You know, it kind of touches on the power dynamics that, you know, you might have in a marriage, or who has a say in what, and who should have the say in various situations.
Right.
And also, you know, the circumstances that you create, the environment that you create for your children, are they the best? You know, are you setting those up for the best amount of success from your children.
I think overall that's what this series really does well, is that they ask these questions that you as a reasonable person in this world of Gilead would ask. I think that's like kind of like even Elizabeth Moss talked about that in an interview, that's her approach to like kind of, for example, the rape scene. She was with this kind of forum of these other actresses and other series and stuff, and somebody asked her, like, how did you kind of prepare for that stuff? She simply said, like, kind of, I just put myself in that situation as, how would I react to stuff? And I would basically turn myself off. And that's kind of what you see, when she's in those moments of stuff, that she's kind of just very disconnected with what's happening and stuff. And I think that's like kind of, from this, simply asking that question. And then other times the writers kind of take over that and just basically ask, what would this character do? And I feel like that's where kind of Game of Thrones starts off that way. But then, of course, after that, they do a lot of the idea of like, we're going to have these things happen no matter what and stuff. And that's like a problem of a lot of writers.
Yeah. I mean, for me, Game of Thrones, it really fell to pieces after season 5 or 6, really, when they ran out of source material.
And they started using plot armor.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say this show is also guilty of that.
Okay.
A little bit. Well, I would say that the first season is really, really engrossing because it's basically just based on the novel.
Sure.
And I've said this already earlier on that season 2 becomes much more character driven.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is though that season 3 becomes much more plot driven rather than character driven. So
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. So I've probably been enjoying season 3 more than season 2.
Okay.
From that sort of attitude. And going back to sort of Elizabeth Moss, it is quite. I mean, we've sort of made this comparison that she's a bit like Veronica Cartwright from Aliens and Body Snatchers, in that she's basically just spends her entire time looking traumatized in various. And I mean, if you're watching this back to back, it's kind of like, okay, pretty much every 20 minutes you're going to see a close up of Elizabeth Moss either staring daggers at someone or crying, and it's just But I mean, she evokes a lot of different sort of different emotion. It's a tough role. I mean, fair play to her. There's most of this season. I'd be interested to see what the actual running time is of just close-ups on Elizabeth Moss's face of her emoting in various different ways, because it's a high percentage. There's not a lot of other stuff that goes on, and it's either her looking slightly mad, desperate, crying, or really, really angry.
Although there's a few interesting moments though, like one of the ones was like this kind of triumphant moment that's I forget exactly what happened was, but they have simple minds, don't you forget about me, right? And it kind of does that's a great callback for us, as an audience to that moment of Breakfast Club, right, where they're kind of like oh yeah, we win it all. It kind of has something similar happening in the plot, and the next minute she kind of like runs into like kind of what's called the off-glen character has been replaced and stuff. And it's like, oh shit! The triumphant moments are not aren't lasting for her at all.
Few and far between. I mean, there's a lot of that kind of stuff in this show, and I'll be honest with you, because I was trying to make it through as much as I could for this.
Okay.
As soon as I saw like music notes on the subtitles coming out, I was like, right, skip 10 minutes, skip 10 seconds, skip. Until I got to the end of the song, and that is my one criticism of this, is there's a lot of very drawn out scenes where not a lot happens. There's people like Elizabeth Moss rifling through drawers or looking for clues or trying to get something out of somewhere, and I ended up just skipping a lot of that stuff to get to what actually happens next. Or there were songs or people sort of looking mournful and crying for a lot of the time. And so this is the problem, is that like it's very sort of weighty material, but as with all things related to TV and movies, you watch too much of it and you're like, okay, come on, what happens next? Which is kind of bad, because you probably should be thinking a little more seriously about some of this stuff. But
also, I think also what you're kind of talking about too is just how our behaviors now with that like with binge watching, that's a lot of times what we do. Like it's a very natural tendency, and unlike like kind of quote unquote the old days, right? And I'm trying not to idealize how things were and stuff like that. We had to wait like week for week for so we had these weeks, the time period between the weeks to digest and process what's happened, to have these discussions maybe by the water coolers like that. But now, like our behavior is such that like like we just like, okay, let's get on with it and stuff, and then let's get to the next episode.
Yeah, and I mean, this is what we'll probably find as well, is that successful binge watching shows, they present novelties in between heavy drama because we want something that will grab our attention in between us flicking forward. And Handmaid's Tale isn't really like that, in that it's just heavy. It's the same tone, and it's pretty relentless.
Yeah.
But I mean, now I'm in season 3. I'm kind of wondering, what am I actually still watching this for? And I'm kind of watching it because I know eventually she'll escape, and I know eventually she'll get her daughter back, and I'm kind of just waiting for that moment now of how that's going to play out, because it's been invented to make me, it's going to do something interesting along the way, and there will be some sort of revenge that will be doled out on the Waterfords and things like this, and we'll just see how that plays out.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Like, how will this play out? Because, like I said, there's that expectation and stuff, and then just kind of similar to Westworld, like kind of, we kind of talked a little bit about like kind of the more recent season stuff. They kind of like, we kind of know that like in some ways, in that series, that the characters are going to like kind of get their liberation, and they're going to what's called have their kind of moments of triumph and stuff like that. But meanwhile, kind of like how does that all go? So I guess, like you said, with the series, like are they just going to have more heavy and kind of like just till that moment and stuff? And
I'm almost at the end of season 3. It's been pretty heavy so far.
Right.
But I mean, it's interesting with Game of Thrones, because by the time book 6 and book 7 come out, people will have forgotten all about the TV show, because it will have been such a lot. I mean, I don't think book 6 it's been saying, oh, it's going to come out, but it hasn't really.
No.
I'm not even sure when it is, but it will come out eventually, I'm sure. People who say, oh, he's going to die before he writes it, it'll probably come out, but it will be, people have forgotten all about it. It won't even be a thing by then, and it will be one of those sort of weird events in life where something very interesting could have happened, and it'll almost take a remake. Fast forward 20 years when we're still doing this, there'll be a remake of where they remake it absolutely and they'll do it really super accurately or something like that. But interestingly, Margaret Atwood is actually writing her own sequel.
I know. I heard about that just recently.
Yeah, and that's going to be interesting, because I obviously, I mean, she is a consultant on the show, but it does make you wonder how happy she is with the various directions. I mean, she seems to be happy-ish with it, but she can't be that happy. She can't be that happy if she's writing a sequel. So it's obviously through her eyes.
Apparently, on the one interview, she was talking about that she's integrating some of the things from the show and stuff.
Okay.
And in fact, like, it's hard apparently she also says that now it's hard for her to not picture those characters with the, actors in mind.
Yeah, I'm sure.
It's like Game of Thrones. Like, kind of, like now, like I kind of read the series after I started watching the show, and it's hard for me not to like kind of picture, kind of the characters as the actors.
Yeah, God help me if I ever try and read the Harry Potter books. That'd be a complete disaster. But yeah, I mean, it will be interesting to see what, because I mean, I think I read something where she sort of said that, basically she wanted to show what happens when a very extreme regime is on the brink of collapse. It's weird because you kind of see it established. And I think that's also the interesting thing is in this is this idea that even though the injustices are so blatant due to whatever economic, political things are happening, and the fact that the rest of the world is also suffering from a lack of children everywhere,
right.
they start looking at thinking, oh, maybe that's not such a bad idea after all. That's really like when the whole Mexico situation happens and you have the delegate there. That's a fairly hopeless episode, because it makes you think, oh, right, they're going to start doing this everywhere now. But
yeah, and, by the way, like kind of the original movie just of course kind of didn't touch on that at all. So and
right.
yeah. And you kind of left with the idea of like or at least the question like is this happening any other than the U.S. and stuff.
Yeah. Although it didn't do, I mean, the original one really didn't do a very good job of explaining how this came about. It didn't explain. But I mean, I like that and I don't like that. I mean, I often criticize movies for being too blatant about this stuff.
Sure.
I think obviously because this wasn't a big success in 1990, they maybe needed to explain more of it to make it perhaps more popular or something. I don't know. But I mean,
I think overall it just wasn't something that kind of people could really relate to. I think that's really it.
Well, I think we'll go back to the very kind of basic view of Hollywood and TV, and that you need a bit of sex and violence, and they tried to do sex. It didn't work. You should have put more violence in it, like the TV show.
Right.
That's where you should have gone. Wrong direction. More violence, less sex, and then you would have had a successful, interpretation like the 2015 TV show.
I mean, I guess it's probably the spoiler we don't need to mention, but I guess I will say that kind of like they did have a bit of more violence kind of towards the ending, I guess, and stuff. We'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
I guess maybe at the last minute they kind of maybe had a little bit of that realization that you had and stuff, but it was too little, too late apparently.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah. So I mean, there's probably a lot of stuff you can delve into with Handmaid's Tale, and I mean, we've probably been talking a good while now. But yeah, I guess it's one of those things that maybe we'll revisit after season 5 when it gets. I'm not sure, but I really did enjoy it. Both, but actually even to some degree the movie as well as the TV show, because it is such an interesting idea. This idea that science fiction can go horribly backwards and not necessarily forwards in terms of our expectations.
Right.
So,
I feel like the series, like besides simply the production value stuff, is also just more relevant. And we kind of touched a little bit about it, that like, during the whole recent, even before the pandemic, actually, just the right wing in the U.S. Has, definitely kind of grasped a lot more hold on not only people's imagination, but it kind of really felt like with the whole, kind of, protests of the right wing, closer to reality than ever. I mean, that's at least from my perspective that like, I just didn't even realize how close we were to, kind of this dystopian, sci-fi becoming almost like a reality here in the States and stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think if one thing you can take away from this, and actually some of the other stuff we've sort of touched on about World War II and some of the atrocities there, is that, the membrane that keeps society normal as we see it is precariously thin, and
more so than I imagined.
Maybe expect. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, the one interview that I kind of sent you stuff, talk about this general, right? That kind of basically, he like, had this commander in chief that was like kind of, had thoughts about like kind of, having a nuclear war with, Iran and stuff like that. And that's something that like, you just wouldn't even really contemplate, even during the times we were closest to nuclear war. I feel like, it's something that like somebody like Reagan, whatever, like, again, during this time that the novel was written stuff, was probably the one of the last things that they were contemplating or last things that they would think to do versus like nth number of other, steps in between and stuff like that. Versus like, this guy who like, just like almost on a whim, like kind of like, oh, I didn't like the election results. Maybe we'll start a war, like kind of, just to kind of like sidetrack things and kind of distract people and stuff like that. Good Lord.
Yeah. Well, I would say I mean, the one thing that is portrayed in the TV show is that it's a progression in the attitude. You see the way Nick's recruited and various other people are sort of recruited into the regime. It does take some time,
Sure.
I think the idea is that's more frightening is this idea that very extreme of ideas, deeply entrenched enough over a long enough period of time, can kind of become the critical mass.
Right. Yeah.
Which is why someone retweeting memes as their sort of political program isn't that worrying really in the grand scheme of things. I don't think.
Yeah, I think the problem is kind of like how many people take it to heart and take it seriously, and then how long do they does it stay in their memory and stuff, like, or the collective memory? Because I totally agree with you that like just one or two tweets that kind of get a view and kind of like maybe a chuckle or whatever isn't going to be as lasting as kind of the ones that like where kind of somebody from there kind of goes on to write a post about it, kind of espousing views of like kind of like why is yeah, that's right, like kind of we need to kind of take actions to our own hands and stuff, and I think that's also the other part about all your idea though too, is that like tweets alone like won't start a revolution, but enough people kind of gathering in place, like kind of it goes back to the idea that like that's the danger of a democracy, right? On the one hand, you give the rights of people to kind of protest and like kind of injustices to gather, the Black Lives Matter movement and stuff, but meanwhile that also gives the rights of extremists on the other end to gather and kind of overthrow your government and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the way we sort of see society at the moment, is that basically a short sort of form stuff that comes and goes, high volatility news and ideas is probably not that sort of dangerous, really. It's more the idea that stuff that I would say Black Lives Matter is one of those things that is slowly, it's very deeply entrenched and is growing and is a very, very strong undercurrent in US culture.
Sure.
And it is increasing. And if things don't become, there's not more sort of equilibrium there, there could be real problems, I think, in terms of stability, we'll say.
So does that like present a possible dystopia of, like kind of the opposite then, like or like another vision of a dystopia, like kind of you see what I'm saying? Like instead of Gilead, then could we have a Wakanda or something?
Man, that won't get greenlit anytime soon. But I mean, it's very obvious. Like you can see the more things that happen, the police brutality, the bigger the reaction becomes.
Sure.
And rightly so. You just think,
sure,
how much longer can you put up with this shit, basically?
Sure.
So that's something, you take that is a very clear, if we're going back to the whole trading sort of analysis, you see sort of trends that increase and are growing. Right. That's a very clear one. Whereas Russians interfering with voting election, that just feels like a spike and a drop. Who the hell cares about that now? Trump's out of office. No one. Right. No one's concerned about Russians hacking into anything anymore.
Right.
So, and this is the challenge you face as someone who's sort of reading or trying to take in information from various sources. What are these things that actually have a real effect on the world, and what are the ones that just are spikes that may or may not? Yeah. So, I think that's the interesting thing of how these things will play out in society. I think what will actually cause a real revolution, what won't.
Right.
Because the spikes won't. Like Russia, we're not going to go on the streets and protest against Russia anytime soon.
Yeah.
But you can be damn sure if the police sort of like accidentally accidentally kill a black person again, there's going to be it's going down,
That's I think the interesting part is that like the spikes matter in the sense of like where if it's something that like will reverberate, that like it will have like an echo, right, and stuff. And the only way you know that, of course, is time, and that's what's like it's so obvious and stuff like that, but it's something that like it's one of those kind of truisms of life that like the most lasting changes, right, isn't like kind of these holy wars and all that kind of stuff. It's the fact that like there was this trade that happened, like kind of like between Europe and the Middle East and Asia, and then that led to the age of exploration, because there was this desire for like spices and like kind of other things that like beyond their bland salt and meat drying existence and stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I guess we will find out, what has the effect, what doesn't going forward. But
coming up, we'll definitely plan future episodes to look at the Invisible Man, as mentioned, with Elizabeth Moss, and then of course more closely we'll be looking at the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle as a kind of a palate cleanser or some ways, or something different.
Maybe not. Maybe it's even more politically charged than Handmaid's Tale.
We shall see. Once again, I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds. Thanks for watching, and we will see you at the movies.